Now, as I said there earlier, we have seen a lot of mainstream coverage around Auckland's dire drought situations. We are certainly not making light of that situation. However, here on Serious Country, it's about the depth behind the headlines, the reality of the flow-on environmental consequences of our impact as a human society. And when things get to breaking point is when we start to pay attention. Joining us now on Serious Country is ECan Councillor Megan Hans. Good evening, Megan.
Hi, Sarah. How are you today?
Good. Now, thank you so much for taking the time. I know that you're very close to the wire when it comes to following the Resource Management Act reforms of Minister David Parker. Could you give us a little bit of an understanding of the current RMA and why it needs changed, but where it goes a little bit too far with David's intentions?
Yeah, so basically what's been proposed is that there's quite significant RMA changes that are proposed, and we haven't really seen too much coverage of that because it's been quite focused on action for healthy waterways. But this morning, thinking about the Auckland water story and thinking about the cries for help that Auckland's putting out there and saying, look, we need this water from this over-allocated catchment. We're a municipal supply, we should have some. It really puts into perspective some of what David Parker's doing. So the current RMA is based on a sustainable management framework, and what that says is essentially it's about providing for the needs of the community, for social needs, community needs, recreation, cultural needs, and health and safety. Now, David Parker's got two lots of RMA reform in play at the moment that came out of the Issues and Options paper last year. But essentially what is proposed in the Issues and Options paper is the potential looking at having a priority within the Act where the environment comes first, then people, and then everything all else after that. So instead of having a balancing act around sustainable management, we're looking at a formalised priority scheme. Now that's a fundamental shift in the way that our resource management allocation scheme works in New Zealand. And I've been really concerned that we haven't been having that conversation. Is that the path that we want to go down? Rightly or wrongly, there will be people on different sides of the fence, but we're not even having the conversation. And I think the Auckland water story is one that's a good case study for us to think about. Does the environment always come first, or is there a balancing act in play here?
Let's talk about the over-allocation of the Waikato River and the fact that there's the 7-year consent that has been discussed for so long, or the application for consent for take by Watercare in Auckland. How bad is the situation with, the placement of these allocations and the understanding? Because there's becoming quite the blow up between councils. This is obviously not in Auckland's backyard.
Yeah, so I'm not fully across the details of the actual consent application itself, but what I do know is what the team from the Waikato Regional Council has said is essentially the water is over-allocated. Auckland, like many other people, have got a consent application in. The way that our current resource management system works is that it's on a first in, first served basis. So if any of that water was to be clawed back and there was available allocation to come in, then the next person in line could apply for that water. Now, the situation is that Auckland's quite far down the list. I think we heard this morning about 105 or 106 down the list. Now, the question that was asked also in the Issues and Options paper late last year was, should priority be based on first in, first served, or should we have a different system for the way in which that works? So there's a few equity issues there around that, because it's also a proposal for looking at the way in which treaty claims and treaty settlements could be moved into that as well as we make the RMA treaty compliant. So some real equity issues around the way in which we allocate water. And first in, first served might not be perfect, but is it the fairest system? Some people in Auckland today might be saying, no, it's not. We need the water more than some of the others do.
Yeah, so therefore David Parker's environment priority first would see that water take of an over-allocated river would not be a priority.
Well, potentially, yes. So that's the issue that we have here at play, is that with the current Act, we've got a bit of a balancing act. You still can't grant a consent for an application that would have effects on the environment that are more than minor or that could be avoided, remedied or mitigate. mitigated. And in the case of where you've got an over allocation, actually a regional council generally can't even approve an application at all, because it would be prohibited because the resource is over allocated. So there's a few different strands and layers to it, but ultimately what it comes down to is that we have to have that fundamental conversation before we get into the detail around, does the environment always come first, or is it a balancing act between all of the competing needs and the way in which we interact with our environment and the way in which we utilise the resource that we have and the way in which we look after it?
Okay, so what about the blanketing RMA process whereby it's so uneven in the different regions? And I'm thinking of the, inequitable situation that I experienced living in Auckland, watching that rainfall fall out of the sky with no storage whatsoever. Yet the pressures of the RMA on Central Otago's ability to have water take from one of the highest volumed rivers, the Clutha River, going past on the lowest rainfall region because of the fact of a blanket RMA. What changes could we see in that inequitable situation?
I think what that ultimately comes down to is that's where the policy does need to be science-led, and we need to think about what the allocation to the environment is, when it's appropriate to take, and that's broadly where regional councils come in. You've got the complicating factor in Otago where you've got hydro schemes there and you've got different needs in terms of energy generation as well. So there's lots in that mix, but it's really important to ensure that we're setting those limits according to the catchments, but also considering some of those wider community conversations. And so if you have an environment first, you would see something Otago probably not a good example with the hydro scheme, but you would see something where the waterway comes first. And a lot of people would say that is ultimately where we should be. How you tick that through and what the impact of that might be in terms of the ability for people to have water for drinking, to interact with it in a recreational sense, and also thinking about what lives in those rivers as well. So it's really complex, but ultimately, if I take it back to where we were before, we need to have a really broad conversation as a nation about what our values in this space are. And at the moment, that conversation's not happening as these RMA reforms are going through, which is the crucial time to have them. Otherwise, change before we've had the conversation ourselves as a society.
But Megan, sometimes the government believe that they need to come in swinging with that stick because some regional councils are getting on with it and others aren't. And if it isn't up to them, then it wouldn't get done. What's your thoughts on that?
That is a fair criticism, and I think that there's a fair criticism of the RMA and that it hasn't worked in the way that it was anticipated, and people from both sides of the fence, if we have a side of the fence around pro-development or pro-environment, are equally as disappointed in the way that the RMA has worked. We have to remember that the RMA delegates authority to different parts of the planning frameworks. You've got national policy statements we've heard a lot about lately, national environmental standards, but we didn't have any of those until the late 2000s, and the RMA came in the early 90s. So we've never actually seen the RMA work in the way that it was intended. So I think it's somewhat unfair to criticise the legislation itself before we think about the implementation and the way that falls through. Yes, there are councils all over the country that have done a really poor job. ECan was one of them until just recently, and that's why the commissioners were brought in. And I think we will see a bit more of a focus on ensuring that regional councils are doing our jobs. And it's really, really important that we do, because ultimately this is about providing good outcomes for the environment and good outcomes for communities. But we need to have that national direction set in place so we know where to go.
What about funding from government to allow regional councils to be able to see out the regulatory requirements and framework that's put on them?
This is a topic quite dear to my heart, Sarah. We've had our annual plan discussions, and long-term plan discussions are continuing at the moment. So we're looking at rates rises and looking at the way in which regional councils are funded. Now, some regional councils have big assets like ports and things, and others like us don't. We are constantly having more and more legislation and requirements put on us, but there's no additional funding for the way for how we might implement those. So ultimately for us here in Canterbury, that means we've got to fund that out of rates. We've been fortunate, we've been quite efficient, but we are still looking at rates rises. And if we continue to have increased responsibility, someone's got to pay for that. And I think it is time that we have a conversation around local government funding and the way in which that works, and whether it is fit for purpose given the amount of delegated authority central government's handing down to local government.
And while I've got you there on the Action for Healthy Waterways policy, Megan, funding to go into the auditable farm environment plans as well. Do you believe that there's going to be funding to that, or is it going to be pushed on the responsibility of regional councils as well to see out this national policy direction?
At this point in time, it's anyone's guess. I haven't seen anything that would suggest there would be significant amounts of funding coming in to deliver some of these programs. I'll gladly welcome it if it's to come our way. But I think what we'll likely see is more of a focus on some of those biodiversity projects. We've already seen some of that, and also some of those biosecurity projects in the COVID recovery around the likes of the wild. Some really good news here in Canterbury to receive some of that funding from MFE and MPI to continue with wilding pine control in the Mackenzie Basin. So I'm really excited about that, and I think that's a great place to put that money.
I just want to close. Also, you would have picked up the Matthew Dolan, the New Zealand Plant Producers CEO, very happy about the amount of money being poured into native tree planting. As an ECan regional councillor, will you be inviting a lot more focus on this, not only from sequestering carbon, but from the biodiversity impacts as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So one part of the annual plan that came out last week, and that was codified by council last week, was a look at a planting and regeneration program, and so I'm excited to see where that might go as well. If we can partner up with government for funding and partner with those nurseries to get some more biodiversity all over our region, that can only be a good thing as long as we're putting the right trees in the right places.
Great way to end. Thank you so much, Megan Hands, ECan councillor, there to close us out on Sarah's Country.
This is Sarah's Country.